The black Mustang's hooves struck the corral fence so hard the wood splintered. Dust rose in thick clouds as the stallion reared again, eyes wild, nostrils flaring red. 3 of the ranch's best hands had already been thrown. One carried out with a dislocated shoulder, another limping bad. Now they all stood outside the fence, watching, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to try again. That's when Sarah McKenna, barely 19, climbed over the rail. She wore her father's old work shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her dark hair tied back with a strip of leather. In her hand, she held nothing. No rope, no bridle, no whip. The men started shouting, her father loudest of all, but she didn't turn around. She walked straight toward that 1,000 pounds of fury and rage, and when she got within 10 feet, she did something nobody expected. She sat down in the dirt, just sat there, cross-legged, hands in her lap, and waited. What I'm about to tell you today will surprise you. But first tell me, where are you listening from? I love knowing which corner of the country you're joining me from. The McKenna Ranch sat at the edge of Copper Valley, where the grassland met the Rocky Hills. It wasn't the biggest spread in the territory, but it was honest land, worked by honest hands. Sarah's father, Thomas McKenna, had built everything from nothing. Every fence post, every barn beam, every water trough. He was a man who believed in hard work, strong coffee, and horses that knew their place. That black Mustang in the corral went against everything he believed in. They'd found the stallion 3 days earlier, tangled in old barbed wire near Widow's Creek. Most wild horses, when caught like that, they give up, or they die trying to break free. This one had done neither. He'd waited, still as stone, eyes burning with something that looked almost like patience. When the hands cut him loose, he didn't run. He charged at the nearest man, teeth bared, then vanished into the canyon like black smoke. Thomas had made the mistake of thinking that meant the horse could be caught. He'd sent 6 men after it with ropes and patience. They'd driven it into a box canyon, trapped it there for 2 hours, thought they'd won. The Mustang had let them think that. Then when they moved in close, he'd exploded through their circle like a thunderbolt, knocking 2 men flat and snapping a lasso clean in half. One man swore the horse had smiled. They'd finally corralled him using tricks and desperation. Fire on one side, high walls on the other, and men on fast horses pushing from behind. Even then, it took until sundown. The stallion had fought every step, had turned and charged so many times the men lost count. When they finally got him into the pen, Thomas stood there breathing hard, hat in his hands, and said something he'd never said before. He said maybe some things weren't meant to be tamed, but Thomas McKenna wasn't a man who gave up easy. That night at supper, he'd announced that whoever could break that black devil would get $50 and first pick of the spring colts. $50 was 3 months' wages. By sunrise, every hand on the ranch was lined up at the corral, bragging about who'd ride him first. Sarah had watched from the kitchen window, arms crossed, saying nothing. The first man lasted 4 seconds. His name was Dutch Peters, a lean cowboy from Oklahoma who claimed he'd broken Mustangs meaner than Sunday church. The black stallion had let him get the saddle on, had even let him climb up. Then the horse had gone straight up in the air, twisted sideways, and come down bucking so hard Dutch's teeth clacked together. He hit the dirt face first and didn't get up for a full minute. The second man was Rodriguez, older, quieter, with hands scarred from 30 years of ranch work. He'd tried a different approach. No saddle, just a blanket, talking soft in Spanish. The horse had listened, ears flicking back and forth. Rodriguez smiled, thinking he'd found the secret. He reached up to touch the stallion's neck. The Mustang's head snapped around faster than a rattlesnake strike, teeth catching Rodriguez's sleeve and jerking him clean off his feet. The shirt tore. Rodriguez rolled away, lucky to have just fabric torn and not flesh. By noon, 5 men had tried and failed. One had a bruised hip. Another had a split lip from where the fence rail caught him when the horse kicked. The bravest one, a kid named Jimmy who couldn't have been more than 17, had lasted almost 10 seconds before getting thrown so hard he lay in the dirt staring at the sky, whispering that he'd seen stars. Real ones. At midday, Thomas McKenna stood at the fence, jaw tight, watching his best hands limp away defeated. He took off his hat, wiped his brow with his sleeve, and stared at that black stallion. The horse stared back, sides heaving, foam at the mouth, but eyes still full of fire. Not broken, not even close. Thomas put his hat back on slow, the way a man does when he's thinking hard about something he doesn't want to accept. Sarah had been inside all morning, same as always. The kitchen was her domain. Her mother had died when Sarah was 12, and she'd taken over the cooking, the cleaning, the mending, all the things a ranch needed beyond horses and cattle. She was good at it too. Her biscuits were light as clouds, her coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and she could stretch a side of bacon to feed a dozen men without anyone leaving hungry. But her hands were always restless, always wanting to be somewhere else. She'd grown up watching her father work with horses, had learned to read them the way most girls learn to read books. A flick of the ear meant curiosity. A stamp of the hoof meant impatience. A soft exhale through the nostrils meant trust starting to form. Her father had taught her all that when she was small, back when he still had time for teaching, back before the ranch got bigger and his days got longer and his patience got shorter. By the time Sarah was 15, she could gentle a horse faster than any hand on the ranch. She had a way about her, calm, steady like deep water. Horses sensed it. They'd come to her when they'd shy from others. Her father had noticed, had even bragged about it once or twice. But then she'd turned 16, and suddenly he started saying things like, "Women don't break horses," and "You're needed in the house," as if all those years of teaching her had been just to pass the time. She'd obeyed mostly, had stayed inside, had done her work, had kept her opinions to herself, but she'd watched through windows, had seen every horse her father brought in, every technique the hands used, every success and every failure. She'd learned more from watching than most men learned from doing. And she'd learned something else too. She'd learned that most men thought breaking a horse meant winning a fight. They were wrong. That afternoon, when the third hand came back with his shoulder hanging loose and wrong, Sarah was wrapping bread dough in cloth for the next day. She heard the commotion outside, men shouting, her father cursing, someone calling for whiskey to dull the pain. She wiped flour from her hands, untied her apron, and walked out to the porch. The scene before her looked like aftermath of a battle. Dusty men, defeated eyes, and in the center of it all, that black stallion standing in the corral like a king who'd just defended his throne. Her father saw her standing there. He shook his head, firm. "Don't even think about it, Sarah. That animal's dangerous. Already put 3 men down." His voice was tired, worn thin by the day's failures. The other hands were nodding, agreeing, some of them looking at her with pity. Poor girl, probably thinking she could help. Didn't understand that this was man's work, dangerous work. Sarah didn't argue. She just stood there, arms folded, watching the horse. The stallion was pacing the fence line, head high, looking for a way out. His coat was black as midnight, shining with sweat, muscles moving under the skin like water. Beautiful and terrifying all at once. Most people looked at him and saw rage. Sarah looked at him and saw something different. She saw fear dressed up as fury. That evening, after supper was cleared and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse to nurse their wounds and their pride, Sarah sat on the porch steps. The sun was setting behind the western hills, painting everything gold and purple. Her father came out, sat down beside her heavy, like his bones were tired. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They just watched the corral where the black stallion stood in the fading light. Finally still. "Gonna have to shoot him," her father said quietly. It wasn't a decision. It was a surrender. Can't keep a horse that dangerous. Can't sell him. Can't turn him loose. He'll just come back or hurt someone else trying to catch him. Sometimes, Sarah, there's just no other way. He said it like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. She thought about all the things she could say, all the arguments she could make, but she knew her father, knew that when he decided something, words wouldn't change his mind. Only proof would. She stood up, brushed dust from her skirt, and walked down the steps. Her father called after her, asking where she was going. She didn't answer. She headed straight for the barn. Inside, she found her father's old work shirt hanging on a nail, the one with patched elbows and a tear in the back from where barbed wire had caught it years ago. She put it on over her dress, rolled the sleeves up to her elbows. Then she took down a strip of leather from the tack wall and tied her hair back tight. No loose ends. Nothing that could catch or snag or distract. She stood there for a moment, breathing slow, steadying herself. When she walked back outside, the sun had nearly set. The ranch was quiet except for the sound of cicadas starting their night song and the occasional stamp of a hoof from the horses in the far pasture. The black stallion was visible in the corral, a dark shape against the darkening sky. Sarah walked toward the fence, and with each step her heartbeat got louder in her ears. She knew her father was watching from the porch, knew the hands were probably watching from the bunkhouse windows, knew everyone thought she was being foolish. She reached the corral fence and put her hand on the top rail. The wood was rough under her palm, still warm from the day's sun. The stallion's head came up immediately. He'd been watching her since she left the porch. Now his ears flicked forward, then back, trying to decide if she was a threat. Sarah took a breath, said a prayer to her mother in heaven, and climbed over the rail. Behind her, she heard her father shout her name. She didn't turn around. The ground inside the corral was torn up from the day's struggles. Hoof prints everywhere, dust thick as flour. The stallion was at the far end, maybe 40 feet away, his body tense and coiled. Sarah took 3 steps forward and stopped. The horse's muscles rippled. He was ready to charge or to flee, hadn't decided which yet. Every instinct was screaming at him that humans meant pain, meant ropes and whips, and the loss of freedom. Every instinct was telling him to fight. Sarah took 2 more steps, then did something that made the men watching suck in their breath. She sat down, just lowered herself to the dirt, crossed her legs, and placed her hands loosely in her lap. She didn't look at the horse directly. That would be a challenge. Instead, she looked slightly to the side, her posture open, unthreatening. Then she waited. Her father was shouting now, telling her to get out of there, voice edged with panic. She heard boots hitting dirt, knew he was running toward the corral. But the black stallion did something unexpected. He didn't charge. He didn't rear. He stood there, nostrils flaring, trying to understand what this human was doing. In his entire life, every human he'd encountered had come at him with dominance and demand. This one sat in the dirt like she had all the time in the world. The stallion took 1 step forward, then stopped. His ears flicked forward, curious despite himself. Sarah's father reached the fence, grabbed the top rail, ready to vault over and pull his daughter to safety. But one of the older hands, Rodriguez, with his torn shirt and newfound respect for the horse's teeth, put a hand on Thomas's arm. "Wait," Rodriguez said softly. "Just wait. Watch." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to climb over that fence and drag Sarah out by force if necessary. But something in Rodriguez's voice made him pause, made him watch. The stallion took another step forward, then another. His head was low now, neck stretched out, nostrils wide as he took in Sarah's scent. She smelled like bread and soap and woman, nothing threatening, nothing harsh. No leather oil, no saddle soap, no sweat of fear. Just stillness and patience and something the horse didn't have a name for. Something that felt almost like understanding. He took another step, now just 20 feet away, close enough that Sarah could see the white foam at the corners of his mouth, could see the small cuts on his legs from the barbed wire, and the day's fighting. Sarah still didn't move, didn't reach out, didn't speak, didn't even shift her weight. She sat there like a stone, like part of the landscape, letting the horse decide. Every muscle in her body wanted to tense, wanted to prepare for flight, but she forced herself to stay loose, stay soft. She breathed slow and deep, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when she was scared as a child. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady as a heartbeat, calm as Sunday morning. The black stallion stood there, 15 feet away now, studying her. His sides were still heaving from the day's exertion, his coat dark with sweat. But his eyes had changed. The wildness was still there, the fire hadn't gone out, but underneath it Sarah could see something else. Exhaustion, confusion, and beneath that, buried deep, a tiny flicker of curiosity. He'd never met a human who sat still, who didn't demand, who didn't take. He took 1 more step forward, close enough now that if he wanted to strike, she'd have no chance to escape. The minutes stretched like hours. Sarah's legs were starting to ache from sitting cross-legged, but she didn't move. The stallion circled her slowly, never taking his eyes off her, testing to see if she'd flinch or run. She didn't. She let him circle, let him sniff the air around her, let him decide in his own time whether she was safe. The men at the fence were silent now, holding their breath. Even her father had stopped shouting. They were all witnesses to something none of them had ever seen before. After what felt like forever, the horse stopped circling. He stood directly in front of her, maybe 6 feet away, his massive head lowered to her level. Sarah could see every detail now. The small scar above his left eye, the dried blood on his front leg from the barbed wire, the way his nostrils flared with each breath. She could smell him too, the sharp scent of sweat and wild grass and freedom. Slowly, so slowly she barely seemed to move at all, Sarah raised her eyes to meet his. What she saw in those dark eyes took her breath away. It wasn't just wildness or rage. It was intelligence, understanding, and pain. This horse had been running his whole life, not because he loved freedom, but because he'd learned that humans meant suffering. Someone, somewhere, had hurt him badly. She could see it in the way he held himself, always ready to fight or flee. The scar above his eye wasn't from barbed wire. It was from a whip or a rope, old and healed but never forgotten. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she did something that made Rodriguez grip the fence rail so hard his knuckles turned white. She extended her hand, not reaching toward the horse. That would be taking. She simply held it out, palm up, fingers relaxed, an offering, an invitation. The choice was the stallion's. If he wanted to smell her hand, he could. If he wanted to turn and run, he could. If he wanted to strike, well, she'd chosen to take that risk. The stallion stared at her hand like it was a snake. His ears flattened against his head, his muscles tensed. Sarah could see him fighting with himself, every instinct screaming danger, but curiosity pulling him forward. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Then, moving so carefully it seemed impossible for such a large animal, the stallion stretched his neck out and touched his nose to her palm. The contact lasted barely a second before he jerked back. But it was enough. It was a beginning. Sarah smiled. Not a big smile, just a small curve of her lips, gentle as morning light. She kept her hand extended, patient, waiting. The stallion stepped forward again, bolder this time, and pressed his nose into her palm for 3 full seconds. His breath was hot and damp against her skin. She could feel him trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of overcoming it. When he pulled back this time, he didn't retreat. He stood there, watching her, waiting to see what she'd do next. Very slowly, Sarah lowered her hand and placed it back in her lap. She didn't try to touch him again, didn't push for more. She'd learned something her father's hands hadn't understood. Gentling a horse wasn't about what you took from it. It was about what you let it give. The stallion shifted his weight, confused by her restraint. Humans always wanted more, always pushed harder. This one seemed content to just sit, to just be. Behind them, Thomas McKenna was gripping the fence so hard splinters were digging into his palms. He wanted to shout at his daughter to get out of there while she still could, but he was afraid any sound would shatter whatever fragile thing was happening in that corral. Rodriguez stood beside him, barely breathing. The other hands had gathered now, drawn by the impossible sight. Jimmy, the kid who'd gotten thrown at midday, whispered, "How's she doing that?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. As the last light faded from the sky, Sarah finally moved. She uncrossed her legs slowly, grimacing at the pins and needles shooting through them. The stallion's head came up, alert, but he didn't back away. Sarah got to her knees, then carefully stood up. Her legs wobbled. She'd been sitting for almost an hour. The horse watched every movement, ready to bolt, but when she didn't approach him, didn't try to corner him, he relaxed slightly. Sarah took 1 step backward toward the fence, then another. She was giving him space, showing him she wasn't a threat. The stallion's ears flicked forward, tracking her movement. When she reached the fence, she climbed over slowly, every movement deliberate and clear. Only when she was on the other side did she turn to look at the horse one more time. He was still watching her, head high, but the rigid tension had left his body. Something between them had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but possibility. Her father grabbed her shoulders the moment her feet hit the ground. "Don't you ever," he started, voice shaking with anger and relief, but the words died in his throat when he looked at his daughter's face. She wasn't crying or trembling. She was calm, steady, and her eyes held something he hadn't seen there in years. determination. "I'm going back tomorrow," Sarah said quietly. "And the day after that. And the day after that. If I need to. You can shoot him if you want, Pa. But you'll have to wait until I'm done trying." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, to tell her absolutely not, to forbid it. But Rodriguez stepped forward, hat in his hands. "Mr. McKenna, if I may," the old cowboy said respectfully. "I've been working horses 30 years. I never seen anything like what I just saw. That girl's got a gift. Be ashamed to waste it." The other hands nodded. Even Dutch Peters, still nursing his bruised pride, muttered his agreement. Thomas looked around at his men, then back at his daughter. He saw his wife in her face, the same stubborn set to her jaw, the same quiet strength. "3 days," Thomas finally said. "You got 3 days. If that horse ain't gentled by then, I do what needs doing." Sarah nodded. It wasn't permission exactly, but it was a chance. She turned and walked toward the house, her legs still shaky, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Behind her she heard the stallion whinny, a sound that wasn't quite a challenge and wasn't quite a call. She didn't look back. Tomorrow would come soon enough. That night Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the horse, thinking about the scar above his eye, about the way he'd trembled when he touched her hand, about the intelligence in his gaze. She thought about her mother, too. How she'd died giving birth to a son who'd only lived 3 days. How her father had changed after that, had become harder, colder, like he was afraid that loving anything too much would mean losing it. She got up while it was still dark, dressed quietly, and went outside. The ranch was silent except for the usual night sounds, crickets singing, a coyote howling somewhere far off, the soft snores of the hands in the bunkhouse. Sarah walked to the corral. The stallion was standing in the center, wide awake, like he'd been waiting for her. When he saw her at the fence, he didn't run. He just watched. Sarah climbed up and sat on the top rail, legs dangling. They stayed like that until sunrise, girl and horse, neither moving, neither looking away. When the sun finally crested the hills, painting the valley gold and orange, Sarah climbed down and went back inside to start breakfast. The hands came in hungry, talking low among themselves, glancing at her with new respect. Her father came in last, looking like he hadn't slept much either. He poured himself coffee, sat down heavy at the head of the table. "After breakfast," he said gruffly, "you can work with him, but Rodriguez stays nearby. Anything goes wrong, he pulls you out. Understood?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hands shook as she served the eggs. The second day was harder. Sarah entered the corral just after sunrise, when the air was still cool and the light was soft. The stallion remembered her. His ears came forward when she climbed the fence, and he didn't retreat to the far corner like he had with the men. Sarah sat in the same spot as before, cross-legged, hands in her lap. But this time the horse came to her faster. Within 10 minutes he was close enough that she could have touched him. She didn't. She just sat there, letting him get used to her presence. By mid-morning, the stallion was standing so close his shadow fell across her. Sarah could hear his breathing, slow and steady now, no longer panicked. She could see the flies bothering his ears, see the dust on his coat. Very slowly, she raised her hand again. This time, when he sniffed her palm, she gently, barely touching, ran her fingertips down the bridge of his nose. The horse froze. Every muscle went tight, but he didn't pull away. Sarah stroked once more, then lowered her hand. That was enough for today, but it wasn't enough for the horse. After she pulled her hand back, the stallion did something that made her breath catch. He stepped closer and lowered his head, pressing his forehead against her shoulder. Just rested it there, like a child seeking comfort. Sarah felt the weight of him, the warmth, the trust implicit in that gesture. Her eyes filled with tears. She reached up slowly and touched his neck, felt the coarse mane under her fingers, felt the life pulsing beneath the skin. They stayed like that for a long time. When she finally stood and left the corral, Rodriguez was standing at the fence with tears running down his weathered face. "Señorita," he said softly, "that horse he knows. He knows you saved him." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't save him, Rodriguez. He saved himself. I just gave him a reason to try." She walked past the old cowboy, needing to be alone, needing to process what had just happened. That moment when the stallion had rested his head on her shoulder, it wasn't about breaking or taming. It was about healing. That afternoon, Sarah didn't go back to the kitchen. She sat on the porch, watching the corral, watching the stallion. He was different now. Still alert, still wary, but no longer frantic. He grazed on the hay someone had thrown in, drank from the water trough, and every few minutes he'd look toward the house, looking for her. Her father came and sat beside her, didn't say anything for a long time. Finally he spoke. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd mentioned her mother in years. Sarah felt something break open in her chest. "She taught me," Sarah said. "Not about horses, about patience, about listening instead of talking, about being still." Thomas nodded slowly. He'd forgotten that about his wife, had forgotten a lot of things in his grief. "I've been wrong," he said, the words coming hard. "About keeping you in the house, about horses being men's work. I've been wrong about a lot of things." He stood up, put his hat on, and walked away before Sarah could respond. But she heard him tell Rodriguez to cancel the order for bullets. The horse wasn't going to be shot. The third day, Sarah brought a saddle blanket. Not a saddle, not a bridle, just a blanket. The stallion watched her carry it into the corral, his body tensing. Blankets meant riding, meant losing freedom. Sarah saw the fear flash in his eyes. She stopped halfway to him, set the blanket on the ground, and backed away. Then she sat in her usual spot and waited. The horse stared at the blanket like it might bite him. An hour passed, 2 hours. The sun climbed high and hot. Sarah didn't move. Finally, curiosity won. The stallion approached the blanket, stretched his neck out, and sniffed it. Nothing happened. No trap sprang, no rope tightened. He pawed it with his hoof. Still nothing. He picked it up with his teeth and shook it, then dropped it. Sarah watched, saying nothing, showing nothing. The horse looked at her, then back at the blanket. Slowly, testing, he walked across it. Once, twice. By the third time, he seemed to understand. It was just fabric. No threat. No trick. When he finally stood calmly on the blanket, Sarah stood up and walked over to him. This time, when she touched his neck, he didn't flinch. She stroked his shoulder, his back, his flank, getting him used to her hands all over his body. When she picked up the blanket and shook it out, he tensed, but didn't run. Sarah laid it across his back. He shuddered. His skin twitched, but he held still. She left it there for a count of 10, then removed it. Did it again, and again. By the 20th time, the horse barely reacted. He was learning that the blanket meant nothing bad. It was just another thing in a world that was maybe, possibly, starting to feel safe. That evening, Dutch Peters asked if he could try approaching the horse. Sarah shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "Right now, he only trusts me. If someone else tries, he'll think I betrayed him and we'll lose everything." Dutch wanted to argue. He had pride, after all, and a reputation. But he saw the sense in her words. The other hands saw it too. This wasn't about proving who was strongest anymore. This was about something deeper, something most of them didn't fully understand but could sense was important. On the 4th day, Sarah brought a rope. She half expected the stallion to panic at the sight of it, but he surprised her. He'd learned over the past 3 days that she didn't lie, didn't trick, didn't hurt. When she showed him the rope, let him smell it, dragged it across his back, he stood quiet. Watchful, yes. Ready to bolt, yes. But willing to try. Sarah looped the rope around his neck loose, so loose he could have shaken it off with a toss of his head. She left it there and stepped back. The horse could have run, could have fought. He did neither. He just stood there, wearing the rope like a laurel, like a choice he'd made. Thomas watched from the porch, coffee growing cold in his hand. His daughter was doing something none of his experienced hands could do, and she was doing it through patience and respect rather than force. It challenged everything he'd believed about horses, about ranching, about the way things were supposed to be done, but he couldn't deny what he was seeing. That black devil that had put 3 men in bed was now standing calm as a pet, wearing a rope, following his daughter around the corral like a puppy. On the 5th day, Sarah decided to try something that made Rodriguez cross himself and whisper a prayer. She was going to ride the stallion. Not with a saddle, not with a bridle, not with anything that would make him feel trapped. Just her and him and trust. She told no one what she was planning. Knew her father would forbid it, knew the hands would think she'd lost her mind. She simply walked into the corral at dawn, before anyone else was awake, and approached the horse. The stallion nickered when he saw her, a soft sound of greeting. Sarah stroked his neck, his shoulder, his back. She pressed against him, letting him feel her weight. He shifted but didn't move away. Taking a deep breath, Sarah grabbed a handful of mane and pulled herself up onto his back. For a moment, nothing happened. They both stood frozen, girl and horse, each processing what had just occurred. Then the stallion took one step forward, then another. He was walking, Sarah on his back, moving in slow circles around the corral. Sarah felt like she was flying. The horse's muscles moved beneath her, powerful and smooth. She had no reins, no saddle, nothing to hold on to but his mane and her own courage. If he wanted to throw her, she'd hit the ground hard. But he didn't want to throw her. He wanted to move, to run. But he was holding back, being careful with the girl on his back. Sarah laughed. She couldn't help it. Pure joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. The sound made the stallion's ears swivel back, listening, and she felt him relax even more. That's when she heard the shout. Her father was running from the house, Rodriguez right behind him, both men's faces white with panic. The stallion's head came up, ears flattening. Strangers running meant danger. His muscles bunched beneath Sarah. She felt him preparing to bolt, or worse, to buck. She leaned forward, pressing her cheek against his neck, and whispered, "Easy, easy. They're just scared. They don't understand. Easy now." Her voice, her weight, her calmness, it reached him. The stallion stood still, trembling but still. Thomas reached the corral fence, grabbed the rail, words dying in his throat. His daughter sat bareback on a horse that had nearly killed grown men, and the animal was standing quiet, protective almost, like he knew she was precious cargo. Sarah looked at her father, saw the fear in his eyes, and something else. Pride. Grudging, complicated pride. "He's not broken, Pa," she called out softly. "He's healed. There's a difference." Thomas nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. He'd come to stop her, to pull her to safety. Instead, he was witnessing a miracle. Sarah slid off the stallion's back, landing light on her feet. She stroked his neck one more time, whispered something only the horse could hear, and left the corral. The stallion watched her go, then did something that made every man present shake his head in wonder. He followed her to the fence and hung his head over the rail, watching her walk away like he was already missing her. Dutch Peters let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That horse is in love." That afternoon, Sarah's father called her into his office, a small room off the main house where he kept the ranch accounts and his one good bottle of whiskey. He poured himself a small glass, stared at it for a moment, then looked at his daughter. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about the ranch, about the future, about what happens when I'm gone." Sarah waited, saying nothing. "I always figured I'd pass this place to a son, but I don't have a son. I have you, and maybe that's not the curse I thought it was." He took a sip of whiskey, grimaced. "That horse out there, you did something I've never seen done, and you did it your way, not mine. Makes me wonder what else you could do if I stopped standing in your way." Sarah felt her heart start to pound. Was her father saying what she thought he was saying? "Starting tomorrow," Thomas continued, "you work horses, full time. Rodriguez will teach you what you don't already know. And when I'm too old to run this ranch, it'll be yours. If you want it." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Her whole life she'd been told her place was in the kitchen, that certain work wasn't for women, that she should be preparing to marry some rancher's son and leave. Now her father was offering her the ranch, offering her a future she'd never let herself dream about. "I want it," she finally whispered. Then, stronger, "I want it, Pa, more than anything." Thomas nodded, set down his glass, and did something he hadn't done since she was a little girl. He pulled her into a hug, brief and awkward, but real. "Your mother would be proud," he said again. "I know I am." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep again, but this time it was from excitement rather than worry. She kept thinking about the stallion, about the ranch, about the impossible future that had suddenly opened before her. She thought about the moment the horse had rested his head on her shoulder, about the trust in his eyes, about how gentleness had accomplished what force never could. She thought about her mother, wondering if somehow, from wherever she was, she'd guided Sarah's hands, whispered patience in her ear. In the morning, Sarah named the stallion. She called him Shadow, because he was black as night and because he'd followed her like one. The name seemed to suit him. When she called Shadow from the porch, his head came up and his ears pricked forward. Within a week, he was gentled enough that others could approach him, though he always watched for Sarah, always relaxed more when she was near. Within a month, he was wearing a bridle and saddle, carrying Sarah around the ranch like she was made of glass. But it was what happened at the end of that month that changed everything. A rancher from 3 counties over heard about the girl who'd tamed the untamable horse. He came with a proposition. He had a mare that was wild-caught, too traumatized to approach, destined for slaughter. Would Sarah try? Thomas looked at his daughter, saw the excitement in her eyes, and told the rancher yes. Sarah could try. And if she succeeded, well, there might be more horses that needed her particular kind of magic. The mare arrived 2 days later in a wagon with reinforced sides. Sarah heard her before she saw her, the sound of hooves kicking wood, the high-pitched squeals of panic and rage. When they opened the gate to unload her, the mare exploded out like a bullet from a gun. She was smaller than Shadow, a paint with brown and white patches, but what she lacked in size she made up for in fury. Her eyes were rolling white, foam dripping from her mouth. Sarah's heart clenched when she saw the scars. Rope burns on her neck, whip marks on her flanks, and something worse. A brand on her shoulder that had been done wrong. The skin puckered and infected-looking even though it had healed. The rancher who'd brought her was a thick-set man named Jacobson, with cold eyes and hands that looked like they'd never been gentle a day in their lives. "She's worthless," he said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Tried everything. Beat her, starved her, locked her in a stall for 3 days. Nothing works, she's got the devil in her. But I heard you got magic hands, so figured I'd give you first crack before I put a bullet in her." The way he said it, casual as discussing the weather, made Sarah's stomach turn. "How much?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady. Jacobson squinted at her. "How much for what?" Sarah met his eyes. "How much to buy her from you, right now, as is?" Jacobson laughed, a harsh sound. "You want to buy a horse that can't be ridden, can't be touched, can't be used for nothing? Girl, you're crazier than people say." But there was greed in his eyes now. He named a price, way too high for a worthless horse, but Sarah nodded anyway. She'd been saving every penny from the ranch work. She had enough, barely. Thomas stepped forward, ready to argue, to tell Jacobson to lower his price or take his horse elsewhere. But Sarah put a hand on her father's arm, shook her head slightly. She counted out the money from a leather pouch, placed it in Jacobson's meaty palm. The rancher bit one of the coins, old habit, then pocketed the money. "She's your problem now," he said with a shrug. "Good luck, you're gonna need it." He climbed onto his wagon and left without looking back, like he was afraid Sarah might change her mind and demand a refund. The mare was in the far corner of the corral, pressed against the fence, sides heaving. Sarah didn't approach. She'd learned that lesson with Shadow. Instead, she pulled up a stool outside the corral and sat down. Not inside with the horse. That would be invading her space. Just nearby. Present. She brought a book and pretended to read, though her eyes kept drifting to the mare. An hour passed. 2. The mare never stopped watching her, never relaxed, but she stopped making those panic sounds. That was something. Shadow in the next corral over hung his head over the fence and nickered softly. The mare's ears flicked toward the sound. She'd been alone so long, fought so hard, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to hear kindness from another horse. Shadow called again, and this time the mare answered. A small hesitant sound, like a question. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Even after everything that had been done to her, the mare was still capable of reaching out, still capable of hope. That first week was harder than it had been with Shadow. The mare wouldn't eat if Sarah was anywhere near, wouldn't drink, just stood in that corner shaking, waiting for the pain she knew was coming. Sarah started leaving food and water, then disappearing, coming back hours later to find it untouched. On the 3rd day, she tried something different. She brought Shadow into the adjacent corral close enough that the 2 horses could see and smell each other through the fence rails. Shadow seemed to understand what was needed. He ate his hay slowly, calmly, showing the mare it was safe. He drank from his trough with obvious pleasure. He stood near the fence and dozed in the sun, completely relaxed. The mare watched him like he was speaking a language she'd forgotten. By evening, she'd moved close enough to the shared fence that Shadow could touch her nose through the rails. It was the first willing touch Sarah had seen her accept. When Shadow wuffed softly, the mare closed her eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to remember what peace felt like. Sarah named her Hope. It seemed fitting for a horse that had survived so much and was still fighting to survive more. Each day, Sarah sat near the corral. Sometimes she read aloud, just her voice, steady and calm, teaching Hope that humans could make sounds that didn't mean pain. Sometimes she sang old songs her mother had taught her. Her voice wasn't pretty, but it was gentle. Rodriguez would walk by and pretend he had dust in his eyes when he saw Sarah singing to a traumatized horse like she was singing to a baby. It took 2 weeks before Hope would eat while Sarah was present, 3 weeks before she'd drink water, 4 weeks before she'd move away from the corner. Sarah never pushed, never demanded, never expected anything. She just showed up every day, patient as sunrise, proving through presence that she wasn't going to hurt, wasn't going to force, wasn't going to break. And slowly, so slowly it was almost invisible, Hope began to believe her. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Sarah arrived at the corral to find Hope standing in the center, not pressed against any fence, just standing in the open. When Sarah climbed over the rail, the mare didn't run, didn't even tense. Sarah sat in the dirt like she had with Shadow, cross-legged, hands in her lap, and Hope walked over to her. Just walked straight up and lowered her head until her nose was inches from Sarah's face. They breathed the same air, girl and horse, and Sarah understood what was being offered. Trust. Despite everything, against all reason, trust. Sarah reached up with trembling fingers and touched Hope's cheek. The mare flinched but didn't pull away. Sarah stroked once, twice, whispered, "You're safe now, I promise, you're safe." And Hope released a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul, a sigh that was half relief and half grief for everything she'd lost. She rested her head on Sarah's shoulder, just like Shadow had done, and Sarah wrapped her arms around that scarred neck and cried, for Hope, for Shadow, for every broken thing that had ever learned to trust again. Word spread fast in that part of the territory. The girl who could heal horses that other people gave up on. Ranchers started showing up at the McKenna place, leading traumatized animals, offering to pay Sarah for her time. Thomas built a second corral, then a third. Sarah worked from sunup to sundown, and still there were more horses than she could handle. She took only the worst cases, the ones destined for slaughter, the ones too broken for anyone else to bother with. And somehow, impossibly, she reached them all. By the time Sarah turned 20, the McKenna ranch had changed. It wasn't just a cattle operation anymore. It was a place where damaged horses came to heal. Sarah had hired 2 helpers, young women from neighboring ranches who had gentle hands and patient hearts. She taught them everything she knew, passed on the lessons of patience and respect that she'd learned from Shadow and Hope. The ranch became known as a place of second chances, and the money from the horsework more than made up for scaling back the cattle operation. But success brought complications. Some of the local men didn't like seeing women doing horsework, didn't like seeing them succeed at it. There was talk in town, whispers that it wasn't natural, wasn't right. A few ranchers refused to bring their horses to Sarah purely because she was a woman, preferring to shoot their animals rather than admit a girl could do what they couldn't. Sarah tried not to let it bother her, but sometimes, late at night, she'd hear those whispers in her head and wonder if she was fighting a battle she could never win. It was Shadow who reminded her why she kept going. One evening, a man showed up with a colt that had been beaten so badly it couldn't stand. The vet had said to put it down, that even if it healed, it would never trust humans again. The man was crying. It was his son's horse, and his son had died in a wagon accident. He couldn't bear to kill the animal too, but he couldn't afford to keep feeding something that might never recover. He'd heard about Sarah as a last desperate hope. Sarah looked at that broken colt, saw its sides heaving with pain, saw the fear in its eyes. She thought about turning the man away, about saying this was beyond even her ability to help. But then Shadow walked up beside her, pressed his nose against her shoulder. Their signal, the one that meant, "I'm here. You can do this." Sarah took a breath, looked at the man, and nodded. "Leave him with me," she said. I can't promise he'll heal, but I promise I'll try. The colt stayed at the ranch for 6 months. Sarah worked with him every single day, first just sitting nearby while he learned to stand again, then slowly, carefully building trust the same way she'd done with Shadow and Hope. There were setbacks, days when the colt would panic at a sudden sound and undo weeks of progress. Days when Sarah wanted to cry from frustration and exhaustion, but she kept showing up, kept trying, and Shadow and Hope were always there, calm presences that showed the colt what healed looked like. The day the colt finally let Sarah touch him without flinching, Rodriguez threw his hat in the air and shouted with joy. The day he took his first willing steps with Sarah beside him, Dutch Peters admitted he'd been wrong about women and horses. The day he trotted around the corral with his head high and his eyes bright, Sarah sent word to the man who'd brought him. When the man arrived and saw his son's horse running free and healthy, he dropped to his knees in the dirt and wept. "Thank you," he said over and over. "Thank you." That summer, Sarah turned 21. Her father was grayer now, slower, content to let her run more and more of the ranch operations. He'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching her work with the horses, and sometimes he'd shake his head in wonder at the daughter he'd almost kept in a kitchen. One night, he called her over, patted the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Your mother would have loved seeing this," Thomas said quietly. "Seeing what you've built, what you've become." He reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. His grip was weaker than it used to be, but still warm. "I was wrong to try to keep you small, to make you fit into what I thought a woman should be. You're bigger than that, better than that. Always were." Sarah rested her head on her father's shoulder the way she used to when she was small. "She's watching," Sarah said softly. "I can feel it. In every horse I help, in every life I save. She's watching, and she's proud." By the time Sarah was 23, the ranch was famous throughout the territory. People came from hundreds of miles away, bringing horses that everyone else had given up on. Sarah's reputation had grown beyond what she'd ever imagined. But the work was the same as it had always been. Patience, presence, proving day after day that gentleness was stronger than force. She'd saved over 100 horses by then, each one a small miracle, each one proof that broken things could heal if given the chance. Shadow was older now, moving a little slower, his black coat showing flecks of white around his muzzle. But he still came to Sarah every morning, still pressed his forehead to hers in that gesture that meant everything. Hope was gentler these days, too, no longer terrified of humans, even seeking out affection from the ranch hands. Together, the two horses had become symbols of what the ranch stood for, proof that the wildest, most damaged souls could find peace if someone cared enough to help them find it. On Sarah's 25th birthday, her father gathered all the hands in the main house. He stood at the head of the table, looking older than his years, but stronger than he'd been in a long time. "I got an announcement," he said, voice carrying the weight of importance. "I'm officially retiring. This ranch, from this day forward, belongs to Sarah McKenna. She built what this place has become. It's only right that it's hers in name as well as fact." He pulled out a deed, signed and notarized, and handed it to his daughter. "Make it something your mother would be proud of," he said gruffly, "though I reckon you already have." The hands cheered, Rodriguez loudest of all. Dutch Peters raised his glass in a toast. "To Sarah McKenna, the best horseman, horsewoman, any of us ever worked for." Sarah stood there, holding the deed, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the weight of responsibility and trust and legacy. She thought about the girl she'd been just 6 years ago, confined to a kitchen, forbidden from doing the work she loved. She thought about Shadow and Hope and all the broken horses that had taught her about healing and second chances. That night, Sarah walked out to the corral one last time. Shadow and Hope were standing together, silhouettes against the starlit sky. When they saw her, they walked over to the fence, and Sarah climbed up to sit on the top rail between them. She put one hand on each of their necks, felt them breathing, felt the life in them, strong and steady. "Thank you," she whispered, "for teaching me, for trusting me, for being my teachers when everyone else thought I had nothing to learn." Shadow pressed his nose to her cheek, warm breath tickling her skin. Hope nickered softly, a sound of contentment, And Sarah understood in that moment that she'd found exactly what she was meant to do with her life. Not just to break horses, but to heal them. Not to force wild things into submission, but to give them reasons to choose gentleness. Not to prove she was as strong as men, but to show that strength came in forms most people never thought to value. The ranch Sarah built would stand for generations. Long after she was gone, people would tell the story of the rancher's daughter who did something shocking, who sat down in the dirt with a wild Mustang and showed the world that patience could accomplish what force never could. They'd tell how she turned a simple cattle ranch into a sanctuary for broken horses, how she taught others that healing was more powerful than breaking, how she proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit still and wait. As Sarah sat there between shadow and hope, the stars bright above and the ranch quiet around her, she felt her mother's presence strong as ever, felt her approval, her pride, her love. The girl who'd been told her place was in the kitchen had become the woman who ran a ranch, who saved lives, who changed minds. And it all started with one moment of courage, one decision to climb into a corral with a dangerous horse and prove that gentleness was its own kind of strength. Sometimes the greatest victories don't look like victories at all. Sometimes they look like a girl sitting in the dirt, waiting for a frightened horse to decide he's ready to trust. Sometimes they look like patience when everyone else demands action. Sometimes they look like choosing to heal instead of break, to listen instead of demand, to give second chances when others say there's no point trying. Sarah McKenna learned that lesson at 19, sitting in a dusty corral with a black stallion everyone said was untamable. And she spent the rest of her life proving it was true. One horse at a time, one gentle touch at a time, one moment of patience at a time. She built an empire not on force or domination, but on understanding and respect. And in doing so, she became a legend. Not because of what she tamed, but because of what she healed. There are decisions that mark us forever, moments when we choose who we're going to become. For Sarah, it was the moment she climbed into that corral. What has been your moment? The time you chose courage over fear, patience over force, gentleness over anger. Leave it in the comments. I love reading your stories. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe. There are so many more stories like this waiting to be told, and I can't wait to share them with you.